"If you hear the bees rise after dark, don't come any closer," old Janka told me, her mouth barely moving as steam blurred the kitchen glass over the marsh. I was standing outside the burned-out collective with my hands deep in a bucket of warm water, washing soot off a hive tool. The air smelled of wet ash, old straw, and that sweet, sharp bee scent that never leaves your clothes once you've lived among them long enough. Around me, the 100 ancient hives hummed in their own low weather, and the whole place looked like a broken tooth at the edge of the reeds. Folks in the dying hamlet still called me a witch. I never corrected them. It saved time. A reclusive beekeeping witch on a burned-out collective shelters a deserter, turning smoke, hives, and a buried sharpshooter's past against the enforcers who come for him. That is how it would sound if someone told the tale after I was gone. It would sound tidy. It would sound like fate had a clean little plan. It never does. That evening, the fog sat low over the marsh, thick as spilled milk, and the hives were restless. Restless. There is a difference if you spent a lifetime listening. Bees know before people do when a bad road has started to roll toward your gate. They feel the pressure in the air. They taste metal before boots hit the yard. I noticed it first in the sound, a little rise under the usual hum, like a breath being held. Then I heard the car. Not close, not yet, but close enough that the gravel on the old lane started to whisper under tires. I set the bucket down and wiped my hands on my apron. The bees were moving in their boxes, and the smoke pot by the shed was already cold. That was a poor sign, and I knew it. Behind me, the collective stood blackened and half swallowed by weeds, windows boarded, roof patched with old tin. In front of me, the marsh fog kept opening and closing like a mouth. Somewhere inside the shed, under the floorboards where nobody in the hamlet was meant to look, lay a waxcloth bundle I had not touched in years. I listened to the engine come nearer and thought of the warning Janka had muttered through the glass, because I had learned that when old women speak softly, they are usually naming the truth before anyone else is brave enough to say it. The engine cut off at the road. For a moment, there was only the bees, the water in the ditch, and my own heart beating once hard against my ribs. Then a man coughed in the dark, and another voice said, "Keep moving, the witch lives here. If you want the rest of this one, subscribe and stay with me." The tires had barely stopped whispering on the gravel when the first man came off the road and into the fog. Not running, not yet. Just slow enough to think he had a chance, and scared enough to smell it on him. I saw his shape before I saw his face, a tall blur with one shoulder lower than the other, like he had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and finally dropped it. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the hives, as if they might speak first. "Don't stand in the open," I said. He flinched at my voice. Good. Men who have done nothing wrong never flinch that fast. He came closer with his hands raised, empty, his coat soaked through and stiff with marsh water. Up close, he was younger than I expected, maybe 25, maybe less, with lips cracked white from cold and a cut along his temple that had dried dark in the wind. The bees noticed him too. A few came out to circle his head, slow and curious, and he kept his mouth shut, which told me he had some sense. "You Bronisława?" he asked. I nodded once. He swallowed hard. "They said I'd find you here. They said if I reached the old collective, maybe you'd hide me." That was the first honest thing he'd said, and it was honest in the worst way. Nobody gets sent to my gate by accident. I looked past him toward the road. No flashlight beams yet, no shouted orders, just fog, the old lane, and that wet, sucking silence the marsh gives before trouble fully shows its face. Then I said, "Name." "Stachu." "Military?" He gave a small, bitter nod. "Not anymore." I let him stand there while I watched his hands. No tremor from drink, no swagger, just cold, fear, and the kind of exhaustion that comes when a man has been running from his own uniform. He glanced once toward the shed, and I knew he had noticed the smoke pipe by the door, the stacked jars, the hooks, the old boards warped from heat. He was looking for a place to fall apart without being seen. "What did you do?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "I refused to fire. I waited." He looked down at the mud by his boots. There was a strike line on the road. Workers, women too. We were ordered to scare them. Then the captain said something else to one man, and I saw what he did. One of them didn't get back up. After that, they wanted me to say I never saw anything. There it was, the real wound, not desertion, witness. The marsh fog rolled in thicker, brushing the bee-yard fence like a hand. Somewhere behind us, one of the hives gave a low, nervous rise. I heard it and made my choice. "Come inside," I said, quietly, "and if you lie to me, I'll know before you finish the sentence." He followed me across the yard like a man walking toward a grave that might still open. Inside the shed, I set a kettle on the stove and pulled down a blanket that smelled of smoke and thyme. He sat on the bench by the wall, shivering so hard the boards creaked under him. When I leaned close to inspect the cut at his temple, I smelled gun oil on his skin under the cold, and something else, panic, raw and metal sharp. Then he saw the floorboard seam, noticed it fast, too fast. His eyes lifted to mine. "What's under there?" I didn't answer, because at that exact moment, from the road beyond the hives, I heard boots in the gravel, and more than one voice saying my name. So I did not waste time answering the road. I slapped the lamp dead with my palm, caught Stachu by the sleeve, and shoved him toward the floor seam before the next voice reached the yard. The shed went dim at once, that gray half-light you get when fog sits thick against old boards and the stove is not yet caught. He stared at me, still trying to breathe quietly, and I dug my nails into his wrist until he understood. Quiet now, no coughing. No stumbling. If they heard a young man panic under my roof, they would stop asking questions and start making holes. He dropped to his knees, and I lifted the board beside the sacks of feed. The smell that came up from below was old dust, iron, and wax. He saw it and blinked once, like a man looking into a grave that had been dug and refilled too many times. I pushed him down into the dark space and slid the board back over him. Not a word, not a sound. The place was too cramped for pride anyway. Then I took the kettle off the stove, poured a little water into the smoker, and packed it with damp straw. My hands were steady. That was the blessing and the curse of growing old around danger. You learn exactly which motions keep the world from breaking open too soon. Outside, the swarming hives answered the smoke with a soft, rising hum. And I knew they had felt the strangers on the road before I had heard the boots. Bees always know when a lie is walking toward them. A knock came at the door. Not polite, not even patient. A fist, then another, then a voice that tried to sound bored and failed. "Open up, old woman." I crossed to the window and looked through a crack in the board. 3 men by the fence, maybe 4. Long coats wet at the hem. Boots caked with marsh mud, faces pale from road cold. The first one had a jaw like split wood. The second kept touching the pocket where his cigarette pack should have been. The third stood back half a step, not talking, just watching the shed and the hives like he wanted to measure which one would burn faster. I knew that kind. Men sent ahead to see how much fear they can buy for free. "What do you want?" I asked through the door. "The boy," the jaw said, "and don't make us dig for him." That told me enough. Cleanup talk. Somebody had already started smoothing the edges of Stachu's story, and now they had come for the part that still bled. I laid my hand against the door plank and listened. The marsh fog had thickened again, pressing against the yard fence, swallowing the lane in strips. One hive gave a hard, sudden buzz, then settled. That was the beekeeper's omen, if you want to call it that. A warning with wings. I did not smile. I had no reason to, but I did reach under the stove and feel for the cold metal I kept there, because if they pushed the door in, I wanted them to meet something older than their orders. Then, from under the floorboards behind me, Stachu whispered my name. and said he had heard one of the men outside say the captain's name too. That was enough to tighten my hand around the latch. I turned from the door without speaking and pointed at the floorboards with 2 fingers. Stachu understood at once. He slid farther down into the crawl space, shoulders scraping wood, and I set the loose board back over him just before the first boot hit the porch. The shed went still, except for the kettle starting to murmur on the stove and the low, uneasy lift of the bees outside. I could smell damp ash, boiled herbs, and the cold iron tang of fear on the man under my floor. "Open up," the same voice called again, rougher this time. "We know he came here." I set the smoker on the flame and packed it with pine needles and old burlap. The smoke came thick and bitter, clinging to my sleeves. Then I moved through the shed with quiet hands, touching what mattered: the jar lids, the hook by the door, the waxcloth bundle under the bench. I did not pull it out. I only laid my palm on the cloth long enough to feel the shape beneath it and remember that the house had once held another life beside mine. Stachu's whisper rose from below. "They said the captain's name." I heard. "Then it's not just me." "No," I said. "It never was." Outside, one of them laughed at something I could not hear. A little farther off, another voice answered, and the tone of it was worse than the first. A man's tone when he knows he can burn a place and call it procedure later. I drew back the latch just enough to crack the door. Cold marsh air pushed in at once, carrying the smell of wet boots and petrol. 3 men stood in the yard now, and a 4th lingered near the road, half hidden by the marsh fog. The one in front had a cigarette pinched between his fingers, though he had not lit it. He was trying to look careless. His eyes kept sliding to the hives. "You're stubborn," he said. "That gets people hurt." "Then you came to the right house," I told him. That made the one with the cigarette snort. The others did not laugh. The tall one in the back kept staring at the hive stacks, as if he had heard the sound inside them and did not like what he understood. Good. Let him be the smart one. Smart men are often the first to panic when the thing they feared turns out to be real. "What do you want?" I asked. "The boy." I shook my head once. "He's not here." The liar with the cigarette smiled with half his mouth. "We're past that now." He reached into his coat and took out a folded paper, then a stub of pencil, then held them up like proof of good manners. "Captain says he saw too much. Says you can hand him over clean, and the old woman keeps her roof, or we start taking boards off one by one." Stachu made the tiniest sound under the floor, just breath against wood. I heard it anyway. Then the back man shifted his weight, and the wet hem of his coat parted just enough for me to see a metal canteen, shaped too square to be water. Fire. They had come with fire after all. I smiled then, small and thin as a razor. "If you're going to threaten my bees," I said, "you should have brought better luck." And from under the boards behind me, Stachu whispered, "Bronisława, there's more of them coming up the lane." I did not answer him right away. Instead, I crossed to the stove, killed the flame under the kettle, and slid the smoker closer to the door. The men outside were still moving through the yard, boots grinding wet gravel. One set of steps circling wide around the hives, as if he wanted to count them. The shed smelled of damp straw, soot, and that sharp little bite of fear that creeps into the tongue when you know the hour has changed. "Stay down," I told Stachu through the floor. His whisper came back thin and tight. "There's a torch." Then they're nervous. I crouched by the hidden board and lifted it just enough to get my fingers under the edge. The wood protested with a low creak. Stachu watched from below, eyes wide in the dim underfloor gap, and when I dragged the board aside, the waxcloth bundle lay there exactly as I had left it, sealed and patient, wrapped against rust and memory. The cloth had gone yellow with age. The wax had a sweet old smell to it, like honey left too long in a warm room. He stared at it. "What is that?" he breathed. I did not answer him either. I only peeled the cloth back. Metal flashed in the dark, old metal, oiled once, oiled again, and kept from the world for too many years. The rifle came free in my hands with that familiar weight that lives in the wrists long after the shoulder gives up. The stock had a nick on the left side where I had once slipped on wet stone and nearly dropped it into a ditch full of smoke. I ran my thumb over that mark and felt, for 1 second, the woman I had been before the hives, before the quiet, before the hamlet decided I was easier to fear than to ask about. Stachu looked at me as if I had stepped out of one life and into another. "You were a soldier," he said. "No," I answered. "I was accurate." A shout came from outside, then another. One of the men had found the hive fence and was cursing because the ground had taken his boot and not let go. Good. Let the Marsh keep a hand on him. I pushed the rifle aside for a moment, dipped the smoker deep, and breathed on the coals until the fuel caught. Bitter smoke rolled up and out in a gray ribbon, crawling under the door and along the cracks in the boards. The first knock turned into a kick. "Old woman," somebody barked. "You're done hiding him." I stepped to the door, rifle in my left hand, smoker in my right. Not raised yet, just held. I could hear the men outside rearranging themselves, one close to the fence, one near the road, one too near the hives. The marsh fog was coming back in patches now, low and thick, sliding between the stacks like it had been called. "You boys keep talking," I said through the wood. "It helps me count how many of you are foolish." That got a rough laugh, but it sounded forced. The man nearest the door shifted his weight, and I heard the tiny scrape of a lighter in his pocket. He was thinking about fire, all right, thinking about it hard enough to make his hands shake. Under the floorboards, Stachu moved once, then froze. "Bronisława," he whispered, and his voice had changed. "One of them's not where the others are." I turned my head. "Where?" "By the road. He's not looking at the shed." A pause, then lower still. "He's looking at the hives." So I knew then which one mattered. The man by the road was the one with a steady eye, the one who stood half a step back and watched the hives like he was reading numbers off a ledger. I set my jaw, because men like that do not come all the way out to a dead collective unless somebody has told them exactly where to look. "Stay down," I muttered to Stachu. He did not answer. Good. He had enough sense left to breathe through his teeth and keep still under the floorboards. I took the smoker out onto the porch, thumbed open the bellows, and fed it damp moss and pine needles until the first gray breath curled from the spout. The smell hit the yard fast, bitter and green, and the closest hive answered with a low, rising hum. Not anger, warning. They felt the change in the air before the men did. Bees always do. I dragged the smoke low, across the steps and into the grass, then let it crawl toward the fence where the quiet one stood. He watched it come without backing away. That told me everything I needed. I lifted the nearest hive lid just an inch, just enough. A warm wave of buzzing rose up under the wood, thick and alive, and the air around me started to vibrate with that hard little sound that gets under the skin if you stand too close. The man by the road touched his collar and turned his head, not toward me, but toward the marsh behind him. Somebody out there had just made a sign, or a sound, or both. There was another one in the reeds. I went back inside and laid the rifle on the bench. The metal was cold enough to sting my palm. For a second, I saw myself the way the others would have seen me if they had been old enough to know better. A widow in black by a burned-out wall, all bent hands and smoke. Then I loaded one round, shut the bolt, and stood by the crack in the door with my shoulder against the frame. "You should go now," I called out. My voice came out calm, almost mild. "There are easier ways to be stupid." The laugh that came back was thin and nervous. The man with the torch shifted his feet. The one at the fence still did not move, and that was what made my skin go tight. He reached into his coat, slowly, carefully, like a priest handling a relic, and took out a little metal whistle on a cord. Not for the others, for whoever was hidden in the marsh. That old feeling came back to me then, the one I had thought the hives had burned out of my blood years ago. The one from a different life, when quiet sights and one clean breath made the difference between a body dropping and a body walking home. My fingers tightened on the rifle. The room behind me smelled of wax, herb smoke, and wet wood. Then the whistle sounded once, just one sharp note. The men at the door flinched. The hives answered all at once, a sudden hard roar under the boards, and from the far edge of the yard I saw the marsh grass bend low where no wind had touched it. Something was moving there, low to the ground, coming up behind the fence line, and the quiet man by the road finally smiled. I saw the smile and knew he was the one giving the tune to the others. The quiet one by the road had the calm of somebody who expected the world to obey him. He lifted 2 fingers, just a small motion, and the shape in the marsh grass answered by moving closer to the fence. So there were at least 4 outside the yard, maybe more, and one of them was already low in the reeds with his belly in the mud. "Stachu," I said without taking my eyes off the door. "Stay where you are unless I tell you otherwise." From under the boards came his voice, tight as wire. "He's not alone." "I know." I fed the smoker again and dragged the mouth low across the porch boards. Bitter smoke spilled over the steps and into the wet grass, then curled around the hive boxes in a thin, gray skin. The nearest bees rose in a soft, warning hum, not enough to fly yet, just enough to tell me they had felt the bad hands coming. The man at the door knocked once more, harder this time, and the whole shed answered with a tiny shiver of wood. "Open up!" he barked. I did not answer him. I moved to the side window instead, lifted the board a finger's width, and saw the man in the marsh straightening behind a clump of reeds. He had a can in one hand and something red in the other, a rag maybe, or a wick. It did not matter. He meant fire. They all meant fire eventually. That was when I understood why the quiet one had smiled. He was not waiting for the door. He was waiting for the hives. A man who burns a house can still be bullied by a fence. A man who burns bees knows the whole yard will turn against him. I reached under the bench, pulled out the old blanket I used for winter wrapping, and flung it over my shoulders. Then I took the smoker in one hand and the rifle in the other and went straight for the back row of hives. Each box was warm under my palm, alive. That warmth steadied me more than prayer ever did. I cracked the first lid 1/2 inch and blew smoke in short, careful breaths, just enough to settle them into a heavy, watchful mood. Then the second, then the third. The sound changed at once, the hum thickening into something deeper, like a room full of people holding their breath. "Bronisława'S," Stachu whispered from below. "They're circling. Let them." I could hear them now, boots shifting in wet grass, one man cursing under his breath because the ground had gone soft around his ankle. Good. The marsh fog was pulling in low across the lane, swallowing the fence line by inches. It made every shape look bigger, and every shadow look like it had teeth. The quiet one by the road raised his arm again, and the torchbearer moved toward the first hive row with the can lifted high. He had made his choice. I slid the rifle up to my shoulder and kept the smoke moving with my left hand. Because I wanted them to see the woman in the yard, the smoke in her hair, the old gun in her hands, and understand 1 second too late that the whole place had been waiting for them. Then the first match hissed in the dark. The match did not catch the way they wanted it to. It hissed, spat once, and died in the wet grass with nothing but a thin curl of smoke. The torchbearer cursed under his breath and bent lower, trying again, and that was enough for me. I blew on the smoker until the bitter plume thickened, then sent it across the porch and down into the yard. The air turned gray at once, and the first row of hives began that low, rising hum that lives under your bones if you stand near it long enough. Stachu's voice came up through the boards. "The one by the road has a radio." "I know." He had a good eye for a frightened man under pressure. The quiet one by the lane never touched the torch at all. He kept his left shoulder turned away from me, and every time the fog shifted, I caught a glint of metal under his coat. Something smaller, a field set maybe, a commander's toy. That meant somebody beyond the marsh wanted news fast. I slid 1 foot back, took the rifle to my shoulder, and cracked the next hive lid just enough to loosen the mood inside. The bees surged up in a warm, angry cloud, not wild, just ready. That is the part people never understand. They think a swarm is chaos. It isn't. It is a decision made all at once. The torchbearer finally lunged, can raised high, and I fired at the ground right in front of him. The dirt burst at his boots. He stumbled, threw his arms up, and the can swung wide. Fuel sloshed over his sleeve. He screamed and dropped the rag. The flame went out before it ever found the cloth. Then the bees hit. The whole front row lifted in a hard black ribbon, and the man gave out a sound I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. He backed straight into the fence, slapping at his face, and the quiet one by the road shouted something sharp and ugly, but it was already too late. The marsh fog had rolled low across the lane, and now the yard had turned into a blind room full of angry wings and men who could not see. "Move left!" somebody yelled from the reeds. That told me there was a fifth voice out there, and I hated that I had not heard him sooner. I took 2 quick steps along the porch, shifted my aim, and saw him, through a gap in the fog, kneeling by the ditch with a second canister in both hands. He had come up so quietly, I would have missed him if the bees had not turned the whole air against him. His coat was soaked black at the hem. His face was pale and fixed. He was looking straight at the hives, not at me, and smiling again. Bronisława. The quiet one's smile did not last long. I put the front sight where his throat would have been if he had stepped up 1 pace, and that was enough to make him stop kneeling in the ditch. The bees had already taken the air, not a full swarm yet, but enough of them to turn the space above the hives into a living black veil. The torchbearer was stumbling backward now, slapping at his face, and one of the men by the fence had dropped flat into the mud, cursing so hard he could not get his breath back. Stachu's voice came up through the boards again, thin and sharp. "That one has a radio." "I see him." The man by the road lifted the set to his mouth without looking at me. That was the mistake. Men who believe they are in charge always think they can divide their attention. I cracked the shot low, not at his body, just at the road beside his boot. Gravel jumped. He jerked hard to the side, and the radio slipped from his hand into the wet grass. He did not go for it. That told me more than if he had screamed. He backed away from the road, and the others started to do the same, a little at first, then all at once when the bees found the first unprotected neck. The one with the torch got it worst. He had thrown his arm up over his face, but that only left the side of his head bare, and the bees hammered him there until he stumbled into the hive fence. The boards rattled. The can clanged to the ground and rolled under the porch. Fuel smell hit me hard and hot, sharp as a slap. There was enough in that can to make the whole place go up if it found flame. I moved before thinking, stepped off the porch, and fired again. This time, the shot took the torch from his hand and flung it into the mud. It did not catch. The marsh fog swallowed the spark. A foolish mercy, maybe, but the kind I could live with. The quiet one finally broke and ran toward the reeds, not because he was brave, but because he had the sense to know the fight had turned bad. He made it 3 steps before I saw the thing in his right hand. Not a gun. A lighter, old metal, polished by thumb and use. He was the one who wanted the fire, not the others. He was the one with the answer for the captain. Then Stachu shifted under the floorboards and hissed, "There's another sound. Listen." I froze. At first I thought it was just the hives, or maybe my own blood in my ears. Then I heard it too, faint and broken through the yard noise. A voice, tinny and far away, leaking from the radio in the grass. Somebody had stepped on the send button when it fell. The speaker crackled once, then a man's voice came through in a hard, clipped burst. "Report, is he there?" The enforcers went still. Even the bees seemed to hold. The marsh fog moved across the lane in one soft sheet, and the quiet one by the reeds looked back toward the radio like a dog hearing its master call. I did not know the voice, not yet, but the men outside knew it too well. Their faces changed all at once, the way faces do when fear gets a name. And from the radio, over the static, came the next words, low and cold as river water. "Bronisława, we know what's under your floor." I killed the radio with my thumb before the voice could say anything else. The yard went silent in a way that felt wrong, not peaceful, wrong. The bees were still up, still hanging in the air above the hives like a black, restless veil, but even they seemed to settle a little when the signal died. The men outside had heard enough. Their faces had changed. That was all I needed. "Did you hear that?" Stachu hissed from under the boards. Yes. The cold sat in my wrists as I moved back to the shed door. One of the enforcers was dragging the torchbearer by the arm now, trying to pull him out of the bee line. Another had gone down on one knee near the ditch and was clawing mud from his eyes. The quiet one by the road was the only one still thinking straight, and that made him dangerous. He had not run. He had not shouted. He just stood there with his mouth tight and his hand inside his coat, talking into the dark where the radio voice had come from. Then he looked right at my shed, not at the hives, not at the porch, at the floor. That was when I knew the captain had told them the truth about the hidden room, or enough of it to scare them. The witch on the burned-out collective was no longer just a rumor in a dying hamlet. Somebody had named me out loud. I crossed to the bench, ripped the waxcloth bundle open, and pulled out the little tin I kept with salt, black thread, and the old key to the underfloor latch. My hands were steady, but only just. When fear comes to a woman my age, it does not always scream. Sometimes it gets organized. "Stachu," I said, "can you climb?" There was a pause. "If I have to, then now is the time." I lifted the board enough for him to crawl up. He came out with dust on his face and blood on one sleeve from where the wood had scraped him raw. He stared at me, then at the rifle, then at the open floor again. No questions. Good. Questions waste time. "Take this," I told him, pressing the tin into his hand. "If they get through the door, throw it into the stove and run for the back fence. Not before." He looked at the tin, then at me. "What is it?" "Enough to slow a man who thinks fire solves everything." Outside, a boot hit the porch, hard. Then another. They were coming in close now, not together, but not scared enough to flee either. I could hear the fog pressing against the walls, wet and soft, and beyond it the swarming hives had gone from warning to fury. That low, rising hum filled the shed floor like a second heartbeat. One of the men shouted, "She's moving him!" The quiet one answered him, and his voice came through the door, thin and mean. "If she wants the boy out, let her. We need what's under there." Under there. Not the rifle. Not just the rifle. They knew enough to be afraid of the wrong thing. I slid the bolt on the old gun, felt the click in my palm, and stepped back from the door. The marsh fog rolled in through the cracks, and for one brief moment, the whole yard seemed to hold its breath with me. Then I heard, from somewhere deeper in the reeds, the sound of another engine starting up, and this one was coming in from the far side of the collective. I heard the second engine before I saw its lights. It came in low from the far side of the collective, not on the lane, but along the broken service track where the weeds had grown up through the ruts. That meant somebody knew the back way. That meant they had come prepared, or had been here before. I did not like either answer. "Back fence," I said to Stachu through the floor. Now, if I tell you to run, you run." He did not argue this time. I heard his nails scrape wood, then the soft thud of his boots as he crawled toward the hidden gap behind the stove. Good boy. No, not a boy. A man, too cold and too frightened to waste his strength talking. Outside, the first crew had gone quiet. That was worse than shouting. Quiet men are deciding. The bees were still up in a restless cloud above the hives, the swarming hives turning the air dark in front of the porch. Smoke drifted through them in thin gray ribbons, and every time the wind shifted, I caught the bitter smell of fuel from the ditch can. One spark was all it would take. I moved to the back window and pulled the board loose with my fingers. The marsh fog was thicker now along the far edge of the yard, hiding the service track until the new headlights split it open. A truck, maybe old army stock, nose high, tires heavy with mud. It stopped just beyond the broken fence, and for 1 second, no one got out. Then the door opened, and a man stepped down, carrying something long and dark under his coat. A shovel. That made my skin go colder than the morning ever could. Men do not bring a shovel to talk. They bring one when they already believe the ground will help them. "Bronisława," Stachu whispered from behind me, and I could hear the strain in his breath. "There's more than one inside that truck." "I know." The first crew by the porch had started to shift again, one of them calling softly to the other, in the kind of voice men use when they think a woman has gone stupid with age. I put my hand on the bench and felt for the old tin I had given Stachu. The key was still in my pocket. The rifle leaned against the wall beside me, metal cold enough to bite. Then the man with the shovel turned his head toward the hive yard, and I saw his face in the spill of the truck lamp. Not the captain. Not yet. The quiet one from the road. He had not stayed behind the lane after all. He had come around to see the back door with his own eyes, and now he stood there watching my hives like a man counting graves. He raised one hand and tapped the side of his coat twice. A signal. From the truck bed, something metallic answered with a soft, ugly clank. And under my floorboards, Stachu went absolutely still. So I moved before the next engine settled its teeth into the yard. "Back fence," I told Stachu, and my voice came out flatter than I felt. "Take the tin. If the boards start shaking, go low and don't look back." He crawled for the gap behind the stove while I tore the waxcloth bundle open just enough to pull the rifle free again. The metal was cold in my hand, sharp with old oil and old memory. I did not have time to wonder how many years had passed since I last held it in daylight. The second engine had stopped, and now I heard boots on wet ground, tools clinking, men spreading out like they had done this work before. I slid to the back window and looked through the cracked board. They had brought more than I liked. 2 men from the truck bed were unloading pry bars, a short iron jack, and a folded chain that flashed once in the weak light. Not a search party, a stripping crew. The quiet one from the road stood by the fence with the shovel in his hand and pointed at my shed floor like he was measuring where to cut first. He had the same calm smile as before, and that made my teeth tighten. He was not looking for the deserter anymore. He was looking for the buried part of my life. "Awful lot of work for one old woman," I muttered. That got me a laugh from the porch side, where the first crew was still trying to see through the sting and smoke. The swarming hives had gone from warning to fury by then, a black, living cloud turning over the yard and cracking down on anything warm-blooded enough to breathe. One of the men stumbled back with both hands over his face, and another dropped the torch in the mud and started kicking at it like a boy. Foolish. The flames never even had a chance. I took the shot at the truck lamp. The glass burst bright and clean, and the whole far side of the yard fell into a dirty, uneven dark. The quiet one by the fence did not flinch. He only raised one arm and tapped twice on his coat again. A signal. A call. Whatever he was summoning, it was close enough now that I could hear a third engine somewhere beyond the road, idling low and patient. That was the beekeeper's omen, if I ever heard one. Not a warning from heaven, just the sound of men arriving in layers. Stachu got through the back gap. I saw his hand once, low in the grass, and then it was gone. Good. I let the rifle settle against my shoulder and fired again, this time at the iron jack. The shot hit metal and jumped wide, but it was enough to send sparks skittering into the damp. One of the men yelped and dropped the jack. Another shouted, "She's got the old gun!" Of course I did. The quiet one finally lost his patience. He came off the fence in a straight line toward the back window, shovel lowered like a spear, and for 1 second, I thought he might actually come through the boards by force. Then a bee cloud hit his face full on. He reeled, swearing, and slammed into the truck wheel, still half blind. I could have dropped him there. I did not. The hives had not yet decided whether to take his eyes or his throat, and I was busy with the other men. Then the truck cab door opened, slowly, carefully. A boot touched the ground, polished enough to catch what little light remained. Then another. A man stepped down from the cab in a dark coat, one hand resting on the doorframe like he had all the time in the world. I could not see his face yet, only the line of his jaw and the edge of a scar near his ear. But I knew the voice that spoke next. "Burn the shed," it said, calm as prayer. "I want what's under the floor before night falls." And I went cold all the way through. The words hit me harder than the cold. "Burn the shed," he said again from the truck, calm as if he were telling someone to fetch water. "I want what's under the floor before night falls." I did not move right away. That is the trick people never expect from an old woman. They think fear makes you rush. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it makes you still enough to hear the real shape of trouble. The man by the truck had not stepped fully into the light. He was letting the others work, letting the yard become his hands. Then the bees answered for me. A hard, rising wave rolled up out of the hives. Not a swarm yet, but close enough to taste in the air. The men by the porch stumbled back on instinct, and one of them swore loud enough to crack the night open. The smoke from my smoker drifted low across the boards, thick and bitter, and the marsh fog came pressing in from the side, like it had chosen a side at last. "Now!" I called to Stachu through the floor. His reply was a muffled scrape, and then the back gap gave way. He slid out into the grass with the tin in one hand and blood on his sleeve, and I saw at once that he had not gone far enough, not because he was weak, because the yard was closing around him from every side. The truckman had brought his crew into a loose half circle, and the quiet one by the fence was already turning to cut off the back path. I crossed to the hive line, kicked up the smoker, and let another cloud roll through the boxes. The hives throbbed under my palms. Living wood, living anger. One of the men reached for the porch rail and yelped when a bee stung his wrist clean through the glove. He dropped the pry bar. Metal rang on wood. Good. Let them hear their own mistakes. Stachu made a run for the fence, low and fast, but he was half blind from the smoke and the sting in his face. I fired once over his head, not at him, but at the ground between him and the nearest man. Dirt jumped. The crew ducked. That gave him 3 steps, maybe 4. Not enough for safety, enough for breath. The man in the truck said something I did not catch. The others listened too quickly, like dogs hearing a whistle. Then one of them yanked a can of fuel from the bed and sloshed it across the first boards of the shed steps. The smell hit me sharp and nasty. That was no bluff. The shed was about to go up unless I made them think twice, so I went back to the one place they did not want me to go. I dropped to one knee by the old flagstone at the base of the hive-shed and lifted the edge with both hands. Under it, tucked in oilcloth and dust, lay the waxcloth bundle and the second thing I had kept from the war. My fingers found the cold metal shape inside before my eyes did. The little box beside it, flat, heavy, full of the sort of metal that changes a man's plans if he gets too close. Behind me, the truck door slammed. And when I looked up, the man with the scar had finally stepped out into the lane, close enough for the light to catch his face, and close enough for me to know that I had seen him before. He was closer than I wanted. Not the captain, not yet. The man with the scar had that same quiet face from the road, only now I could see what had been hidden under the coat. A narrow mouth, pale eyes, and the kind of stillness that comes from ordering other people to die. He stepped into the lane and stopped when he saw me by the open flagstone. His gaze went straight to my hand, then to the waxcloth bundle, then to the little metal box beside it. "So that's where you kept it," he said. I did not answer. I set the box down on the stone and slid the rifle up in one smooth motion. The bees were still boiling over the yard behind me, and the smoke from the smoker hung in the air like a dirty veil. Somewhere off to the side, Stachu was still moving through the grass, trying to make the fence before the yard closed over him. I had no time to spare for the man in front of me, except enough to see the truth in his eyes. He knew me. He knew the woman before the hives. The one with a rifle in her hands. "You should have stayed buried," he said. That one made something hard and cold go through my chest. Only one person had ever said those words to me in that tone. Not this man. The voice was wrong, but the shape of the threat was the same. Then he smiled, and I saw the bottom edge of a scar I had missed in the dark. A thin line under the ear. The kind a man gets when a shot glances off bone and he lives long enough to become proud of it. He lifted one hand, and the crew behind him froze. There were 6, maybe 7, spread through the yard and the track, one with a fuel can, one with a pry bar, one crouched behind the truck wheel with his jaw swelling red from a sting. They did not move without him. That told me enough. He was not the captain, but he had weight. The captain had sent him because he trusted him with the dirty end of the work. "What do you want?" I asked. He glanced at the open hatch by the hives. "The thing under the floor, the thing your deserter saw." I let out a small breath through my nose. So Stachu had told me the truth. He had seen something, and now the men who came for him were afraid of what he might have heard, which meant it was worse than I had thought. The man with the scar took one step closer. "Hand it over," he said, "and I might let the boy live long enough to run." I laughed then, though it came out dry. "Listen to you," I said. "You talk like mercy is still yours to give." That changed his face. Not much, just enough. I had struck the thin place. He reached inside his coat, and I moved first. I fired past his shoulder into the fuel can in the truck bed. Metal burst, fuel splashed in a bright arc across the mud and wheel rim, and for one heartbeat, the whole yard smelled like a fire waiting for a name. The men shouted, the bees rose harder, and from the far side of the collective beyond the marsh fog and the broken fence, another engine finally cut loose and came straight toward us. The engine's growl changed the shape of the yard. It was no longer a threat in the distance. It was a thing with weight and breath, grinding up through the ruts behind the fence. I slipped the little metal box back under my arm, kept the rifle in my right hand, and shouted for Stachu to keep moving toward the rear gap. He was already there, half crouched in the grass, face white with smoke and panic, but he kept his head low and did what I said. That counted for something. I went to the hive line and lifted the waxcloth bundle with my left hand while the rifle stayed ready in my right. The cloth was warm from the day's heat, damp at the edges from all the smoke. Under it, the old pieces sat in silence, the brass mirror, 2 wrapped rounds, and the black thread I had used once for a wound that would not close unless you lied to it first. I did not need all of it. I needed enough. Across the yard, the man with the scar had finally come forward. He did not rush. He knew the others were watching him, and he liked that. The bees rose harder when he stepped into the open, a deep, swarming lift that made the air tremble around my ears. The marsh fog slid low behind him, turning the truck and the men around it into shadows with edges. For a second, I could almost pretend I was back on a winter ridge, watching shapes move through whiteout, waiting for the wrong one to stand still. Then I saw his mouth. That was it. Not the scar, not the coat, not the way he held his shoulders. The mouth. Thin, proud, always set, as if the world had already offended him. I knew that mouth from years ago, from when I was young enough to believe a rifle could settle a whole ugly world into one clean line. He had been a boy then, not a man, and he had stood behind me on a frozen slope, handing me cartridges with both hands because his fingers shook too badly to hold them one at a time. I had not expected him to survive long enough to grow into this. "Move," I muttered, and fired. The shot cracked the front lamp on the truck, and glass sprayed over the mud. One of the men yelled. Another swung around too fast and slipped in the wet. The scarred one flinched only once, then slapped his hand down on the hood and shouted for the crew to spread out. He still had control of them. That was the worst part. Men like that never stop being dangerous. They just get better furniture. I cracked the nearest hive lid and gave them what they feared most. The first bees tore out in a black ribbon, then another, all of them boiling into the light and smoke. One man went down on his knees with both hands over his face. Another smashed into the fuel can and sent it skidding under the truck. The smell hit hot and sweet and ugly. I could hear Stachu behind the fence now, running low through the reeds. "Burn the shed," the scarred man shouted. And then from the truck's far side, another voice answered him. Not the scarred one, not the crew, the captain. "Wait," he said, quiet as a knife laid flat. "I know that woman." I turned my head just enough to see him step out of the fog, and the blood in my hands went cold. I knew him before he finished stepping out of the fog, by the way he stood with his chin lifted just enough to make everyone else look smaller. The captain had that same old habit, the kind that never leaves a man even when the years put silver in his hair. He stopped near the truck and watched the yard as if he had owned it once and expected it back. "Still alive," he said to me. I kept the rifle level and said nothing. The swarming hives were furious now, the whole front row heaving in a dark, living cloud above the posts. Smoke from the smoker hung low and bitter in the cold air, mixing with the fuel smell from the truck bed until the whole lane tasted like a match waiting to fail. Behind me, under the floor, Stachu made one small movement, then froze again. Good. Stay there. Let the old ghosts do their talking first. The captain's eyes flicked to the open flagstone, and his mouth tightened. Recognition. He knew the shape of the hiding place, which meant he had heard enough from the man with the scar to understand what I had kept under the shed. He lifted one hand, and the crew around him stopped at once. They listened to him like dogs. That told me the truth I needed. The scarred one had not been lying about who mattered. "You should have stayed in the ground," the captain said. I felt the words in my ribs before I let them out through my mouth. "You first." That pulled a smile from him, thin and mean. Then he looked past me, down toward the rear fence where Stachu had gone through. "The boy saw too much," he said. "So did you. That was always your trouble." The trouble. That word opened a door in my head I had sealed long ago. Snow on a ridge, breath frozen white in front of my face. A younger version of that same mouth, not yet hard with command, handing me cartridges while I lay behind a stone wall and waited for men in the white below to move into range. He had been fearless then, in the stupid way boys sometimes are. I had taught him the rest. He had never forgiven me for that, or for surviving when the others did not. The captain took one step closer, and the bees answered with a hard, rising roar. One of the men behind him flinched and slapped at his neck. Another dropped the pry bar he was carrying. The lane turned wild for a second, all fog and wings and the hot stink of fuel. I moved without thinking, fired into the truck tire, and the shot tore rubber with a sound like cloth ripping in a storm. The truck sank hard on that side. Men shouted. Somebody cursed. The line broke just enough for me to see the captain's face change. Recognition. That was worse. He reached inside his coat, slow and deliberate, and when his hand came out it held a pistol with a long, fat barrel, the kind made for a man who wants to settle arguments at close range. He pointed it at the shed door, not at me, at the floor, at what he believed was under it. His voice stayed quiet. "If you don't bring it out, he said. "I'll put a round through the boards and let the rest sort itself." Then, from somewhere beyond the fence line, a single shot cracked the dark. Not mine, not his. Everyone turned at once, and in that one heartbeat while the captain's head tilted toward the sound, I saw the man with the scar stepping out from the marsh fog with blood on his sleeve and something black in his hand. I did not waste a second wondering whether the scar on his face belonged to the same man I had known in the snow. He came closer through the smoke with the black notebook held out in one hand, and then he hurled it into the mud between me and the captain. It slapped open on impact. The pages were damp at the corners, but the writing inside was clear enough. Names, dates, roads, sheds. Little blunt notes in the captain's hand, the kind men make when they think paper will keep their hands clean. The captain's eyes flicked down to it and went flat. "You said you'd let me walk," the scarred man said. His voice had gone rough with blood and cold. "You said it was just the boy." The captain did not answer him at first. He only stared at the notebook like it had grown teeth. Behind him, one of the crew moved toward the fuel can, and another took a step for the back fence where Stachu had gone through. I brought the rifle up and kept it there. The metal was cold against my cheek. Around us, the swarming hives kept climbing higher, a dark, living noise in the air that made every man in that yard look smaller than his fear. Then I recognized the mouth, just the shape of it, the way it tightened on the left before a lie or a command. It pulled me back to a ridge covered in hard white snow, to a boy with shaking fingers handing me cartridges one by one because his hands were too cold to trust. He had been all sharp elbows and stubborn eyes then. I had not expected him to grow into this face. I had not expected him to come back wearing blood like a second coat. "You should have stayed buried," I said. He swallowed. Something in his face shifted when he heard my voice, as if a door had opened inside him that he had spent years keeping shut. "I tried," he said. "He made me carry this. He said if I did what he wanted, he'd burn the book and let me go." The captain gave a short laugh, no humor in it at all. "And you believed me?" "I believed you once." That landed harder than any shot. The captain's hand twitched near his coat, and the crew spread out at his silent signal, trying to find angles, trying to find fear that could be used. One man crouched by the truck wheel with a lighter in his fist. Another reached for the pry bar. I shot the lighter out of his hand before the flame ever caught, and the sparks vanished in the marsh fog like thrown salt. The scarred man looked from the captain to me, then down at the notebook again. His jaw worked. He was not free yet. I could see that much. Not by a long road. But he was no longer standing on the captain's side of the line. "He's got the shed marked," he said quietly, and I heard the shame in it. "Not just tonight. Months back." The captain's face did not change. That was the worst part. The worst men never look surprised by their own filth. They only look inconvenienced when somebody reads it back to them. He lifted his pistol and pointed it past me, not at me, toward the open floor under the hive-shed. "Last chance," he said. "Hand over the book. Hand over the deserter. Then we're done here." I almost laughed at that. Done here. As if the yard, the bees, the cold, and all the names he had buried in ink were pieces on his table. The scarred man bent, picked up the notebook, and opened it to the first page, his eyes fixed there. Then he went still, his face drained of what little color it had left. Slowly, like he was afraid of what he would see, he turned the page toward me, and there, in the captain's hand, under one line and one date, was my name. For one long second, nobody moved. The captain stared at the page with my name on it, and the whole yard seemed to shrink around that single line. The bees were still up in the air, but even they had gone tighter, lower, as if the wind itself had learned to hold its breath. I could hear the fuel hissing where it had splashed into the mud, and beyond that, the small, ugly crackle of the marsh fog moving through the reeds. The scarred man looked from the notebook to the captain, and then back to me. "You knew her," he said. The captain did not answer. That told me enough. He lifted his pistol a little higher, not at me this time, but toward the scarred man, like a man who had suddenly remembered where the knife had been hidden. "Put it down," he said. His voice had gone flat. "You're making a mistake." The scarred man laughed once. No humor in it, just a dry little burst, like a match struck in an empty room. "The mistake," he said, "was yours." That was the crack I needed. I shoved the rifle against my shoulder and fired into the mud by the captain's boot. The shot threw dirt across his coat and kicked his balance half a step sideways. Not much. Enough. The man with the pry bar lunged too late for cover, and the bees hit his face so hard he dropped to his knees, shouting. Another crewman swung the fuel can up like a shield, and the smell of it washed over the whole yard again, hot and greasy and dangerous. "Stachu," I called without looking back. "Now!" I heard him break from the rear fence, fast and low, boots tearing through grass and broken reed. Good. Let him go while the captain's eyes were still on the notebook. The deserter did not answer. He did not need to. The boy had learned one thing in the last hours that the army never taught him. When the grown men start lying, move. The scarred man stepped in front of the captain's gun. That surprised even me. "You told me it was a clean job," he said, and his voice had gone rough and thin. "You told me she was a nobody." The captain's face changed then, just a little. Not guilt, annoyance. A man getting tired of his tools talking back to him. He shifted his weight, and I saw his free hand slipping toward his coat pocket, where he kept the spare magazine. Old habit. Good soldiering. Bad mercy. I knew the shape of that movement. Years ago, on a slope full of hard, white silence, that same hand had passed me cartridges with shaking fingers. The boy from the ridge had grown into the captain, and the captain had grown into this. That was the real curse. Men do not stay one thing for long. They sharpen. The scarred man saw it too late. He turned his head just enough to catch the edge of the captain's wrist when it came up, and the pistol cracked once into the air. The shot went wild over the hive row. One bee cloud burst apart in a hard black spiral, and the yard erupted. I dropped the rifle, bent, and yanked the waxcloth bundle from under the flagstone with one hand, while the other found the little metal box. The old box had weight enough to matter. I flipped it open, thumbed the latch, and saw the dull brass shape inside. Not magic, not a miracle, just a thing built to answer fire with a harder kind of smoke. The captain saw it at the same time I did. His eyes locked on the box, and for the first time all night, he looked afraid of what he remembered, of what I had kept. And from the far side of the collective, through the marsh fog and the shouting and the bees, another voice called out my name. Not the captain's, not the scarred man's, but Stachu's, and he sounded like he had found something in the reeds that should have stayed buried. I did not need a second look to know what the page was telling me. My name sat there in the captain's hand like a hook in raw meat, and under it was a date from years ago, back when the snow on the ridge had been so hard it sang under boots. I felt the old cold move through my shoulders. Not the weather kind, the other kind. The kind that comes when a man who thought he was done with you has been carrying your name in a pocket all this time. The captain watched my face and saw that I understood. That was the worst thing for him. He had hoped for surprise, or fear, or maybe a little old woman's confusion. Instead, he got memory. "You kept me," I said quietly, "because you were afraid of what I saw." His jaw tightened. The crew around him shifted their feet in the mud, the swarming hives lifting and settling over their heads like a black veil. One of the men near the fuel can glanced toward the truck, then toward the fence, then back to the captain, waiting for permission to breathe. Even the marsh fog had gone still along the ditches, heavy and wet as wool. The scarred man looked from the page to the captain and back again. His face had gone pale under the dirt. What is she talking about? The captain did not answer him. He reached inside his coat with slow, ugly care, and I saw him thinking the same thing I was. The notebook was no longer a shield. It had turned into a mirror. So I opened the metal box. Inside were just 3 old smoke flares, a folded map wrapped in oilcloth, and 2 little brass charges I had kept from another life. The smell of metal and wax rose from the box together, sharp and dry. I took 1 flare, thumbed the cap, and let the end catch against the edge of the lid. It hissed at once, white and angry, spitting sparks into the mud. Every man in the yard flinched. That was enough for movement. "Back," I said. The captain's mouth opened, maybe for an order, maybe for a lie. I never gave him time to choose. I threw the flare low across the truck bed, and the smoke burst upward in a hard white cloud that swallowed the wheel, the fuel can, and half the men behind it. The bees answered with a sudden furious rise, and the whole yard turned loud with wings. One of the crew dropped the pry bar and stumbled into another man. The scarred one stepped sideways, eyes watering, and the captain cursed because he had lost the line he liked to keep between himself and panic. I moved the way I had once moved on the ridge, when one clean action could keep a whole bad hour from becoming a burial. Not fast, exact. I grabbed the waxcloth bundle with my free hand, tucked the rifle against my ribs, and stepped back toward the hive row while the smoke thickened. The captain shouted something through the white, but I only caught 1 word: burn. Then Stachu cried out from beyond the fence, not fear, surprise. "Bronisława," he yelled, and his voice came ragged through the reeds. "Come here, you need to see this." The captain froze. For the first time since he stepped out of the fog, he looked past me instead of at me. And when I heard what Stachu had found in the ditch behind the truck, I understood why the captain had gone so still. I reached Stachu before the captain did. He was crouched in the ditch behind the truck, one hand buried in wet grass, the other holding up a little bundle wrapped in oilskin. Paper. The kind that gets men killed for carrying it. His face was streaked with mud, and he looked at me like he had just dug up a grave that still wanted paying for. "Under the wheel," he said. "It was jammed into the muck." I took the bundle from him and peeled it open with my thumb. Inside was a folded map, 2 typed pages, and a strip of photographs gone soft at the edges from rain and time. Names. Rows of them. Strikers, drivers, 1 storekeeper from the hamlet, and beside each name a mark in the captain's hand. Sent. Moved. Quieted. I kept reading until I hit the 3rd page and saw the ditch line behind my own shed drawn in black ink with a little cross at the bend. A burial note. The cold moved through me so clean I almost stopped breathing. This was not just a cleanup crew. This was a list, a place to put what the captain could not keep in his mouth. Stachu watched my face and knew what I'd found. "There's more," he said. "At the bottom. I think it's where they've been taking the ones nobody asks about." I looked at him, then over his shoulder to the yard. The scarred man had 1 hand up, holding the others back, while the captain said something low through his teeth. The swarming hives still boiled over the porch, and the marsh fog had thickened into a dirty gray wall that swallowed the fence line. For a second, I could hear only the faint clink of the fuel can rocking in the mud. "You're leaving," I said. He blinked. "No." "You are." I pressed the oilskin packet into his chest. "Take this north. Go along the reed cut until you hit the old pumping track. There's a concrete culvert under the road with a dead flashlight nailed to the beam. Wait there until dawn. If nobody comes, keep going." He shook his head once, hard. "I'm not running again." "This isn't running." I shoved the little brass flare into his hand. "This is surviving long enough to be useful." That got him quiet. I pulled the waxcloth bundle back under my arm and tied the old map shut with black thread. Then I went to the shed door, checked the latch, and dragged the smoking pot to the threshold so the bitter breath of it would keep drifting out. The bees had settled some, but not enough to trust. Their anger was still in the boards. It would keep the men nervous for another few minutes, maybe 10 if the fog held. Stachu took one step backward, then stopped. "What about you?" I looked past him at the captain standing in the lane with my name in his hand, and I felt that old ridge cold settle into my bones again. "I stay with my house," I said. "You take the road." He wanted to argue. I saw it in his jaw. But then the radio in the captain's truck crackled once, high and thin, and every head in the yard turned toward the sound. From the speaker came one hard burst of a voice I did not know, speaking too fast to catch all of it, except for the last words. "Meet us at the old pump house. Bring the woman's papers." So I sent him north and turned back to the shed. The yard felt emptier without Stachu in it, but not safer. The captain's last words still hung in my ears, and the bees knew it too. They stayed low over the hives now, not rising, just circling tight and mean in the gray air. I shut the door, barred it, and checked the floorboard seam where the hidden notes had been. The waxcloth bundle sat where I had left it, warm from my hand, and I tied the black thread around it once more, as if a knot could hold the whole day in place. Outside, the marsh fog had thickened again. It pressed against the windows in wet patches, hiding the lane, hiding the road, hiding the old pump track Stachu had taken north. If he made the culvert before dawn, he might still live long enough to matter. That thought should have comforted me. It did not. It only gave me something to do. I laid the rifle across the table and took stock the way I had once done before a winter hunt, before the world went rotten and men started keeping names in notebooks. One flare left, one brass charge. The map, the little box, enough to make a night loud if I used it right. More than that, maybe. The captain had named the old pump house in front of everyone, and there was no mistake in his voice. He wanted the papers there, which meant he thought I would come alone, or not at all. That was a poor guess. I found the kettle, filled it, and set it on the stove. The hiss of water warming was the only clean sound left in the room. Then I pulled the old map flat and studied the road cut again. The culvert, the bend by the birch line, the narrow track that fed into the pump house yard. The place was a rotten concrete box from the old days, half swallowed by nettles and mud. It had one front door, one loading hatch, and a rear spillway choked with reeds. Not much shelter, plenty of shadows, the sort of place men use when they think nobody is watching. A knock came at the door, soft this time, from the radio set on the shelf. I stared at it for a breath too long before the speaker crackled. "Old woman," a voice said, rough with distance and static. "You listening?" The voice was not Stachu's, not the captain's either. New, male, calm in the way men get when they have already laid the plan and only want to see whether the world will obey it. I took the receiver in my hand and said nothing. He went on, as if I had answered. "The boy made his culvert. Good. Let him keep walking if you want him to live. You come to the pump house with the papers, or we start taking pieces out of your yard, one by one." I looked at the hives through the window. They had settled into an uneasy hum, something closer to expectation. A beekeeper's omen, if you liked pretty words for ugly things. I did not like pretty words. "Who are you?" I asked. A pause, then a small, dry laugh. "Someone who knows what's under your floor," he said, "and who knows you remember the snow ridge better than you want to." The line clicked once, then held, and in that thin, dead silence I heard it, faint at first, then clearer, the approach of engines on the far road, coming not toward my shed, but toward the old pump house. I followed the sound of the engine deeper into the yard and found Stachu where the reeds broke beside the old drainage cut. He was half on his knees, half in the mud, staring down at something dark and flat that lay jammed under the edge of the culvert. He did not look up when I came near. He only held out one shaking hand, and in it was the corner of a photograph, wet and torn, showing the captain and 3 others standing over a ditch with shovels. The same kind of ditch the notebook had marked. "More," Stachu said, and his voice cracked on the word. I crouched beside him. Under the culvert lip was a bundle wrapped in plastic, swollen with water but still holding. I dragged it out with 2 fingers. Inside were more photographs, a receipt book, and a second list written on thin paper that had started to bleed at the edges. Names again. Some crossed out, some circled, some written twice, as if the captain needed to remind himself who belonged to him. At the bottom, one line in hard black ink. Pump house transfer, before dawn. The words sat in my hands like a dead thing. So that was the place. The old pump house. The captain had not been bluffing. He had wanted the papers there because that was where he meant to burn the last of the evidence and anyone who came with it. My skin went tight with the same old cold, the kind that makes the back of your teeth ache. Stachu looked from the paper to my face. "He knew this was here all along," he said. "Didn't he?" "Yes." "And he sent me to find it." "Yes." He swallowed and looked away. For a second he seemed younger than he had any right to be. Just a boy, standing in mud, with his whole life rearranged by a list of names. I wanted to tell him to keep his head down and run as far as he could, but there was no use in lies, not now. I tucked the bundle under my arm and turned toward the truck. The yard had changed while we were by the culvert. The swarming hives were lower now, thick over the porch and moving in a slow black arc toward the lane. Smoke still crawled from the smoker by the door, bitter and gray in the marsh fog. The captain and the scarred man had stopped shouting at each other and were listening to something on the radio, though I could not make out the words. Men standing still with guns are always waiting for the wrong thing. Then I saw it. Not the captain, not the truck, the rear road. A second set of headlights had come on beyond the trees, pale and steady, and they were not moving toward us. They were moving away from the collective, toward the same old pump house I had been sent to by voice over the wire. That meant somebody had already gone ahead to prepare the place. Or somebody wanted us to think so. "Stachu," I said, "how many are with the captain now?" He squinted through the fog. "6 I can see, maybe more in the trees. Not enough to hold the yard if I made them panic. Too many to rush without help. The kind of numbers that make a woman old before her time." I pulled the brass flare from my pocket and set it in my palm. The little thing felt heavier than it should have. Then I looked at the map one more time, at the culvert, the road bend, the pump track, the dead flashlight nail point Stachu had described. If the captain wanted a meeting at dawn, then dawn was still only a rumor. We had time for one more turn. The radio on the truck crackled again. This time the voice came through clear enough for me to hear the shape of it, but not the name behind it. "Bring the witch," it said. "The papers are already burning." And somewhere out on the dark road, beyond the marsh fog, I heard a door slam shut. I didn't trust the invitation to the pump house, so I took the long way through the ditch line and came in under the reeds where the ground stayed soft and black. The old tracks were there, half swallowed by mud, and every step gave off that cold, rotten smell of water that has sat too long without moving. I kept the waxcloth bundle tucked under my coat and the brass flare in my palm. The marsh fog sat low over the road, broken only by the spread of one truck's lights ahead and the dull orange pulse of something burning behind the pump house wall. The smaller kind, paper fire, the kind that eats names. When I reached the concrete embankment, I saw what they had been burning, just the top pages. The rest had been spread across an old oil drum lid and fed in strips, so the smoke carried up slow and gray, full of half-ash and ink. I could make out the captain's handwriting even from where I stood. Lines, dates, transfer marks. The same ugly hand from the notebook, only now he was trying to erase it with flame instead of paper. A man never really changes. He just picks a hotter way to lie. I heard voices from below, through the spillway hatch. One was the captain's. Another I knew at once, rough with cold and blood, and that stubborn edge the scarred man had. Stachu's voice was there too, thin and cut short, like somebody had told him to be quiet, and he had listened. So he was inside. Good, bad, both at once. I moved to the side door and put my hand on the latch. It was warm. Someone had gone through recently. Maybe the papers had already burned. Maybe not all of them. My stomach tightened in that old way it did before a shot. There was a narrow office window on the north side, too high for a man to climb through, but low enough for me to reach if I stood on the intake block. I climbed it, pressed my face to the glass, and saw the room inside. Tables, 2 lanterns, a map nailed flat with wet corners, and on the floor, a stack of files opened like dead birds, some already blackening at the edges. The room stank of smoke, damp cement, and a bitter chemical smell from the pump motors below. The captain stood at the far end, one hand on the table, the other resting on Stachu's shoulder like a leash. Stachu's face was split with a fresh cut, but he was still on his feet. That made me breathe once. Slow. The scarred man stood off to the side with his gun lowered and his jaw hard as stone. He looked at me through the glass and did not look surprised to see me there. He tapped the table once, then he pointed down. There under the map, half hidden by the files, I saw it, a square patch of fresh concrete near the wall. New work, too smooth, too white, the kind men pour when they want the ground to forget something. The captain turned at the sound of the tap and followed the scarred man's finger to the window. His mouth moved. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the shape of them. Orders, threats, the old language. Then the north door behind me creaked open a hand's width, and from the dark inside the pump house, a voice I had not heard since the ridge said, very quietly, "Come down, Bronisława. The water has your name in it." I went down the service steps with the rifle tucked tight and the waxcloth bundle under my arm, and the first thing I smelled was wet iron. The pump house was colder than the marsh outside. Damp walls, old oil, burned paper. The room below the hatch was already half lit by the last of the files they had tried to feed to the flame, and the fire was losing. The captain stood near the concrete patch with one boot on a stack of folders and a lighter in his hand. The scarred man was by the valve wheel, and for the first time all night, he did not look like he belonged to the captain's side of the line. He looked tired, human, dangerous in a different way. "Did you bring it?" the captain asked. I looked at the floor instead of him. The fresh concrete patch was there under the map, smooth and wrong, and now I saw why the room had that bitter smell. It was a grave with a lid, not just for papers, for people. The scarred man saw me looking and gave one hard nod. He did not need to say it. The captain had been using the pump house the way some men use a ditch, to make the ground forget. I heard the swarming hives outside before I saw them. They were no longer at my yard. They had followed the smoke and the cold down the road in a black, restless ribbon, slipping through the vent slats and gathering at the broken window above the spillway. The captain saw them too, and his mouth tightened. "You brought your little curse with you," he said. "No," I told him. "That came with you." The scarred man reached for the valve wheel and turned it. Water groaned somewhere deep in the concrete, then answered with a hard, metallic cough. The floor shivered. I lifted the brass flare and set it on the map. The captain saw the motion and lunged for me. Too late. The scarred man slammed his shoulder into him, and the lighter flew from the captain's hand, skittering under the table. It died in the wet. Then the concrete patch cracked, not all at once. A hairline split, then another, Then a wet black seam opened under my feet, and water began to push up through it like a fist. The captain stared at the floor as if it had betrayed him. From the crack came a smell I will not forget as long as I live. Mud, rust, bones. The scarred man spoke without looking at the captain. "That's the strike line you buried," he said. "You told us it was a cleanup. It was a grave." The captain swung on him, wild now, and the room burst into motion. I fired once into the overhead pipe. Steam and spray filled the room. The hives outside slammed against the vent grates in a sudden, furious rush, and the captain staggered back, blind in the white. The scarred man grabbed his wrist. The pistol dropped. Water climbed higher, curling around boots, around the table legs, around the blackened papers. Names loosened from the pages and floated up in strips. The captain tried to run for the hatch, but the flood had already taken the stepwell, and the old concrete gave under him. He went down hard into the spillway water, flailing once, then twice. When he came up, the face I saw was not a boss's face anymore, just a man in the dark, with no ground left under him. I did not shoot him. I did not need to. The room itself was done with him. By dawn, the reeds around the spillway had already begun to straighten, and one strip of black paper still clung to a cattail, white on one side where the ink had washed clean. The witch went home to her hives while the concrete dripped behind her, and the first jar of honey on the sill caught the morning light like a small, patient fire. If you want more stories where the old places keep their teeth, subscribe and stay close.